All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Anderson House. My name is Andrew Allen and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of the Continental Army officers and their French counterparts who founded the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory and legacy of the American Revolution. In addition to tonight's lecture, the American Revolution Institute fulfills that aim by supporting advanced study, developing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done all of this work from right here at its headquarters, Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark that was completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson here in Washington, D.C. Tonight's lecture, a program that is made possible in part by a generous gift from the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, features historian Euguene Procknow discussing how the son of a British soldier became an American citizen following the American Revolution. William Hunter accompanied his father, a non-commissioned officer in the British Army's 26th Regiment of Foot, while on campaign during the American Revolution. And throughout the war, Hunter witnessed the firsthand terrors of combat, was captured twice, and produced the only surviving account written by a child of a British soldier. Drawing from Hunter's recently discovered journal, which is right back there on that table, so please feel free to look at it afterwards. Tonight, Mr. Procknow will discuss, will highlight his experiences during the American Revolution and how they influenced him to eventually become a citizen of the United States in the early years of the Republic. Euguene Procknow is an independent historian of the American Revolution. Since 2013, he has authored 20 scholarly articles for the Journal of the American Revolution. From 2015 through 2022, Mr. Procknow's articles have been selected and published in the print edition of the annual volume of the Journal of the American Revolution. In 2022, he also published his first book, William Hunter, Finding Free Speech, a British Soldier's Son Who Became an American, which is on sale in the back there. So I'm sure he'd be very happy to sell you a copy and sign it for you afterwards. And Mr. Procknow also hosts and curates a website, researchingtheamericanrevolution.com, that assists researchers in locating primary source materials pertaining to the Revolutionary War. But before I turn things over to Mr. Procknow, the usual housekeeping items are in order for those of you joining us on Zoom this evening. Following the lecture this evening, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions at any point during the presentation by using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted by using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you as always. So without further delay, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome to Anderson House, Mr. Euguene Procknow.
Thank you, Andrew, for that gracious introduction. And I just want to open up. He mentioned that there's the journal in the back, which forms the basis of my book. And I want to just mention the McWilliams family. Rita, the current repositor of the journal, is here, and I'm sure she'll be glad to show that to you afterwards and answer any questions about that. Also, I want to take special notice of Louise McWilliams and Louise Higbee, who spent their time in preserving this amazing document so that we can see it today. So I want to very much thank them for that. Also, would like to thank my family for being here and so many dear friends for being here. So, and those, I'd like to thank the ones on Zoom that came here. So with that, I'd like to open by taking us back to 1798. Now, I know none of us were alive back in 1798, no matter how old we are today, but I want to just think back up being here in the second year of the John Adams administration. So as we know, John Adams was the second president of the United States. And this was the beginning of our political process where we had two political parties. John Adams was a Federalist, and he was opposed by Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson, who were Democratic Republicans. That's what we called them back. They were one group back then, believe it or not. So, and what what they did is that the Federalists were losing their grip on power. And so they passed something called the Sedition Act. And that Sedition Act outlawed the criticism of the government or any government official. So think about that, outlawed criticism, and it was very broad. And the penalties for that was draconian. So what happened was 1 week after it was passed, a gutsy Kentucky newspaper editor published the first editorial opposing this act. And he published that editorial knowing that he'd go to jail, his family could become destitute, and his business could go bankrupt. And that person is William Hunter. And this is the editorial. I'm going to spare you. It's a full page. I'm not going to read the whole thing and spare that to you. But this was the editorial, July 21st, 1798 was published. It was published back under the byline of someone called Aristides. Aristides is Greek from the ancient times. Back in old times, people liked to publish news accounts under a pseudonym. That was kind of the rigueur of the day to do that. And Aristides, the readers would have known that that person was known for truthfulness and integrity. And so that's why they published it under his name. And this is a picture of Aristides a symbolic picture of him. And so he published this in under a pseudonym, but the pseudonym would not protect him, because under the Sedition Act, it's not only the writer of the editorial that would be prosecuted, it was the newspaper editor and newspaper owner that could be prosecuted. And what happened is that they decided to go after William Hunter here, but John Adams intervened and said, no, I don't want to do that. There are more fertile grounds elsewhere. They didn't think they could get a Kentucky jury to convict him. So venue did matter. It still matters. That really mattered back then. And so they decided not to do that. They did go on to convict 26 other newspapers for sedition and threw many people in jail. One of the most famous is Matthew Lyons, who served in Congress while in Vermont jail under this act. So it had a lot of teeth. It took a lot of courage, and it was a gutsy thing for him to do. So why this was a big deal, there's actually just as amazing kinds of things that William Hunter did in other parts of his life. And so I want to go back and start the story earlier with his life. He was a sergeant, as Andrew mentioned, son of a sergeant in the 26th Regiment of Foot. He was born in New Jersey. He came over with his father. His father and mother came over before he did. He was born. He had a brother that was older than him that was born before him. Unfortunately, he passed very shortly after the birth of William. This is a copy of the journal, and so you'll see it up close and personal and back there. But as you can see, that this is in beautiful 18th century handwriting. It's gorgeous handwriting, and it takes a little time to go through it because we're not used to reading cursive anymore. But it is actually gorgeous handwriting, and it's really kind of neat. It's 35 pages long, 9,000 words, but it's got some flaws to it because it's missing the first 2 pages. And actually, William Hunter's name is not anywhere in those first several pages. Also, subsequent family members had cut out things. There's a couple of missing pages, and then there's some annotations that the family has made over the years in pencil throughout the document. But it is a gorgeous find. This is a remarkable document, and one that is probably one of the more rarest documents that you can find here in our country, because there are no other ones like it around. So his early life, he ended up being born in Brunswick, New Jersey. The picture on the right, your right, This is Brunswick, New Jersey. As you can see, it's a seaport town. It's on the banks of the Raritan River in New Jersey. It's about 150 houses, 3 churches, and a barracks. They had built a barracks for the British soldiers during the French and Indian War. And so William's family and father lived in those barracks. Back then, soldiers' families lived with soldiers when they were deployed overseas, and that was a natural thing to do. And if you go, those barracks are pretty small. It was pretty tight living, but that's what they did. Now, this was about the time we all know about the Boston Massacre in 1770. So this was just about the same time, and we learned from our history books that the relationship between the Bostonians and the British Army was just horrible. It was vicious. It was fighting. It was there was some death and destruction associated with it. It was farthest from the case here. In fact, there are letters and documents talk about parties and dinners, and they laud each other. It was very much different. It was a very good, close, symbiotic relationship. And when the townspeople got in trouble, the soldiers helped them out. So it was a much different situation here. You would never, in living here, you can see why later on he was shocked when the war started, because it was such a good relationship. In fact, it was so good that when some trouble happened in New York, they transferred Sergeant Hunter's unit to New York because they figured they could get along with the New Yorkers better. And for the most part, that is the case. But as the British armies want to do, they don't let you stay in one place very long. So they sent him off to Montreal. And so he went to Montreal, and this is the first place where he went to school, and also he learned French. So remember that for later on, and learning some French will be important in his life. So remember that from later on. In Montreal, they also had some very good relationships with the Montrealers. There was a major fire in town, and the soldiers helped put out the fire and help rescue people. And it was again a completely different experience than the Bostonians and the 27th Regiment in Boston. So when the war broke out, they were shocked. They were absolutely shocked. And so it completely disrupted their family life. William and his mother stayed in Montreal, and his father was sent 30 miles south to Fort St. John. And this is Fort St. John here. It's near the Quebec U.S. border. It's kind of an interesting sidelight. Is the fort? You see the 2 houses there, the house on either side. One of those is guy Moses Hazen, who's a rebel, and the other on the other side was a loyalist. So they connected the 2 forts. So it's kind of funny about that. And they connected by a stockade. But about 300 or so British soldiers held out on that fort, and an American general, Richard Montgomery, came and laid siege to that fort for 53 days. They bombarded the fort really into almost nothing. So it didn't look like this afterwards. It was pretty much destroyed. And in one of those shelling incidents, Sergeant Hunter, William's father, was sitting near a keg of dynamite, and the shell hit the dynamite, blew up, and Sergeant Hunter got egregiously burned. And so he was pretty much out of action. He survived, but he was egregiously out of action. So what happened is that when the fort surrendered, the Americans wanted to march the British soldiers off to captivity in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. But what they did is they couldn't march William's father off. And so they brought William's mother and William down to Fort St. John, and then they took them to another fort that's 8 miles away, Fort Chambly. And so this is where he spent the winter of 1776. It's a masonry fort. It was lightly bombarded. Here's the fort right here. It's a masonry. It's a reconstructed today. It looks a little better, but it was a heck of a lot more hospitable to survive the cold Canadian winter. By the way, this is a depiction, a 21st century depiction of a British sergeant. He's got the halberd, which is the long, skinny thing there, and then he wears the little waistcoat with the sash on it, and that denotes that he's a sergeant. And it denotes that he's a sergeant because he's got a gold stripe on it. If he didn't have the gold stripe, he'd been an officer. But so this is what William's father would have looked like. Unfortunately, we don't have any pictures of William, so that makes it a little bit harder. But he spent the winter here, and he tells a story about how the British soldiers reacted to the death of Richard Montgomery. American general, Major General Richard Montgomery, died in a New Year's Eve assault on Quebec City, and he was killed really in the opening moments of the battle. But he was a former British officer. And so it's interesting that the diary talks about how the British soldiers lamented the loss of a rebel, but because he was a former British officer. So, we think today that this was, two separate things. We got Britain, the United States. Back then, it wasn't quite as separated out. And so people had feelings for folks on the other side, and the sides were a little more fluid than you might think about today. So anyway, so he spent the winter here recovering, and remember this for later on. His mother learned how to treat burns. Okay, that's another little tidbit which will come through his life. So in the springtime, William and his father and mother traveled down to their prisoner of war camp. So they're up here at Fort Chambly, go through Fort St. John, down to Lake Champlain. And this Lake Champlain is frozen then. And so what they had to do was they went on the frozen ice in a sleigh, and they chose March as the time to go because it was warm enough to travel, but not too warm that there wasn't any ice. But unfortunately, there were some gaps in the ice, and they would lay these planks over the gaps to pull the sleigh over these planks. And sometimes those planks didn't work out, and the horses would go like this right into the water. They'd have to cut the reins. And so William talks about horses and people perishing that way. So again, remember that's another tidbit that's going to come through this presentation. That's his first experience with death. And remember, we're talking about a pre-teenager here in this situation. So it's big in his family. So he goes down the Lake Champlain. They go to by Ticonderoga, Lake George, and they get on the Hudson River and go down through to New York. And in New York, he tells another good story in his journal. He says that, boy, I saw the Continental Army officers and their beautiful uniforms. Well, remember, this is early on in the war, and nobody really ever describes the Continental officers' uniforms as beautiful. So this is a boyish comment, and early in the war. So it's just it's kind of remarkable that someone would do that. So he went from New York and through Brunswick, where he lived, down to Trenton, and then over to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And that's where they were incarcerated in a prisoner of war camp. He got there in June of 1776. And the prisoner of war camp kind of looked like this. This is the barracks that was built in the French and Indian War to house soldiers, and the local inhabitants built a stockade around the barracks. It was in the middle of the city. William and his mother had run of the city. They could go in and out of the barracks at will. The father could not. The Americans did something to the British that really annoyed the British, but was done for security and safety. They separated the officers and the enlisted men. And so the officers were sent to outlying towns, and the enlisted soldiers were incarcerated in this stockade. And the reason why they did that was to inhibit escape attempts. Because if you think about this, they're living in the middle of a town. There aren't that many soldiers to guard them, and they wanted to keep them away from having to overpower the few guards and take over the city and escape. So they did that. And William tells a story that's also told in other historical accounts of rumors that a rebel outfit was going to take retribution on the prisoners and kill them for some harsh treatment of American prisoners in New York. And unfortunately, nothing came of that, but it really scared the Hunter family pretty dramatically because they were unarmed. If you notice on the right here, this is a grave. Sorry. This is a grave marker here, and it's kind of a poignant grave marker in Lancaster today. It's a memorial to the British and the American soldiers that perished while at this prisoner of war camp. So it's a rather poignant thing. It's in the churchyard. It's in the church, the Anglican churchyard, and the local inhabitants had to take. I will support the king of the marriage vow. And once they did that, about 10 soldiers in William's unit got married to local Lancaster women. So it wasn't. This 26th Regiment of Foot seemed to do pretty good with relationships with local inhabitants. Eventually, then William's father was exchanged. Back then, what you do is if you have some prisoners and I got some prisoners, you would exchange them for each other. William was exchanged and sent back to New York. You might have thought this was a good thing. It may not have been all that great. New York was pretty much burned down. Most of New York was burned down, and it was a pretty harsh place to live. They lived in a kind of a half wooden, half earthen hovel here in the city. There wasn't really barracks, in the way that you'd have barracks elsewhere. They may have lived for some time in tents, and they may have commandeered some people's homes for some time, but it was a very tough living. They spent time there. And the other part that was really unpleasant, I say unpleasant, that's just a nice term for harsh. But the other thing that happened here is his father immediately went back into combat. And he went on raids in New Jersey to find food and forage for their animals. So it was a very military people would say highly kinetic activity. So he was on multiple raids. And then he went on a big mission. And this is up the Hudson River. This is the picture of the Hudson River. It's near the Mid-State Bridge by Bear Mountain Bridge by Fort Montgomery and Fort Clinton. The British came up the river and from this way here, and they under General Henry Clinton, he faked to the right and did a big feint to the right, and then went left, which completely befuddled the Patriot General Israel Putnam, and they landed their troops on the other side of this mountain, and then they marched all the way in the back here and outflanked the Americans that were in forts, in those twin forts. Now, it was a really great strategy, but it was still a lot of hard combat. And William's father was assaulting Fort Clinton. And just imagine this. You have these entrenched patriots behind earthworks with guns and cannon, and you're going to go over a 200-yard open field to attack. And that's what he had to do. And so they lost a lot of people. And this leads to one of the really poignant stories in his diary. And that's that after this, they put the wounded on the ships and took them down to New York and then put them on wagons. And in the diary, it talks about William going from wagon to wagon looking for his father to see if he was among the dead and the wounded. And this is a young boy, again, still preteen. And so he was looking for his father, and the sense of relief was just palpable. So So it was not all that easy duty for him, and saw a lot. He had to grow up really fast. Then they didn't stay in New York very long. They went to Philadelphia. Whether exactly William witnessed this scene, he witnessed, this is the HMS Aurora blowing up. The Americans blew him up in Delaware Bay on the way to Philadelphia. But William did witness the destruction of a ship that was in front of him. So that's in the diary. And so he was on part of the armada that sailed up Delaware Bay to open up Delaware Bay. And after they did that, they docked in downtown Philadelphia, and he spent the winter in Philadelphia. Now, all of us know the story of Valley Forge, right? The deprivation, no shoes, no clothing, no, crude huts, horrible sanitation, lots of disease. And our storybooks talk about how, or our history books talk about how the British Army was so they were living high off the hog in warm Philadelphia around the fires. Could be farthest from the truth. William's family suffered immensely that winter, just like the Americans suffered at Valley Forge. There was very little food. The Americans inhibited food from going into the city. Back then, soldiers received rations, and their spouse received half rations, and their children received quarter rations. He said, okay, I kind of got that. But when you're in garrison, they reduced it by 50% because those rations were rations for being on campaign. So they didn't have a lot of food. And in other places, William could earn money. He earned money, and his mother earned money. Philadelphia was not very easy to do that. So it was a really tough duty in Philadelphia. It was not the easiest thing to do. In the springtime, Williams got on a ship again, sailed back to New York. His father marched through New Jersey, participated in the Battle of Monmouth, which is a famous battle. It was kind of like the heat of like today. It was a hugely warm and heat prostration. Actually killed more people than bullets that day. So it was a brutally hot battle. But Williams is interesting. His journal, he talks about they got into New York, the New York harbor, and their boat was chased there by the French fleet. They just got there just hours before the French. So the French could have captured him there. And they could have captured New York too, but the fleet got there first. So he spends time in New York. But by this time, William's father had been in war for three years. He was probably older than the average soldier. He was born in 1726. So he's older than the average soldier. And he was what they called worn out. And that was the term they used in the Army. So exactly what his ailments were, we don't really know, but he was unable to withstand the rigors of continuous combat or campaigning. So they sent him back to Britain on a recruiting mission. His unit was pretty much combat, what we call today combat ineffective. It was pretty decimated. And so they needed to recruit more soldiers into the unit. So they sent him back to Britain to recruit soldiers to come to America. And so he was on that recruiting mission. So that was the idea. But in reality, what happened was they got separated. Their ship here got separated from the main convoy. And so as the ship was going to sail into the English Channel, a French privateer attacked them. Again, William witnessed death. He witnessed a British officer lose their leg and lose their life to a cannonball on that deck. So again, another horrible incident that a young boy had to witness. But after that, he and his father and mother and sister by this time went into a prisoner of war camp in Normandy and spent a year there. William and his father were separated from his mother and sister, and it was done because his father needed hospitalization. So William spent most of that time nursing his father. And remember, I mentioned that his mother had gotten some expertise at burn care, and she was working for a French aristocrat, and that aristocrat had a child that got scalded, and so she tended to that child and got that child back to health. And as a result, she got invited to a dinner party with Lafayette. So kind of cool. And again, that'll come back later in William's life later on also. But I think it's because she was able to, she had some experience doing that. And that's what she was able to do. So after about another year, he got exchanged again and went back to England. And they made it back to England. He spent time in London. He went to Coventry. He went to several different places in England. So he got a really great experience there. Ended up going to Scotland and walking. He walked to Scotland with his father, and then his father couldn't walk back, so they took a carriage back. So he got a chance to kind of see that territory. But by this time, he was getting to be too old to be a child anymore, and he had to earn a living. So his father and mother purchased an apprenticeship for him. Back then, you just didn't say, "I want to be an apprentice." You had to buy that right to be an apprentice. And so I believe that the Hunter family used the bounties that they got from recruiting soldiers to fund William's apprenticeship. Oh, I should tell a story about that, though. It's it shows the character of William. When he was needed to get a job, his father said, "Well, you're going to go in the military," and his mother goes, "No way! There's no way you're going in the military." And in his journal, he goes, I could just see him do this, and he said, "Oh, thank God." I believe later on in his life that he was a really confirmed pacifist. And I think for all these things that he witnessed here as a young boy, I think it would do that to anybody that had to go through that. So he ended up learning a trade. And with learning, the printers are people kind of in between. So they're not common laborers, but they're not part of the intelligentsia, but they kind of go between those two because they have to be literate. But there's also a lot of hard manual labor associated with operating that printing press. But he did gain an education. He got to meet some pretty famous people. And then he ends up attending lectures by Joseph Priestley, the guy that invented club soda, and oxygen, but he was both a dissenting minister as well as a anti-monarchical Republican, advocated for the Republican form of government, which was clearly out of step with the British. And so so when Priestley was hounded out of England, William says, "I think I'm going to do the same thing." And so that's why he left for the United States, really was to find free speech. And so he came to the United States. He came first to Philadelphia, but then he moves west. He founds 3 newspapers, one in Western Pennsylvania, and then 2 in Kentucky. The Mirror there is where he published the editorial against the Alien and Sedition Act. In the Palladium here, he published many articles about the trial of Aaron Burr, the treason of Aaron Burr trials, the Spanish conspiracy, where a lot of Kentuckians wanted to join the Spanish Empire and break away from the Americans. So he had quite an experience there. He also became politically aware and became a politician himself, served 10 years as a town trustee, which is like a town manager today, and then also served in the Kentucky legislature. During this time, he ended up developing some really strong relationships with politicians. So when Marquis de Lafayette came in 1824 to the United States, he came to Frankfort, Kentucky, where William Hunter lived, and there's actually documentation of William's wife Anne providing food for Lafayette's visit. I would have loved to have been in that room with them to find out what happened. I should have mentioned earlier that the journal ends in 1793. It's only the first 25 years of his life. So we don't have his, well, the rest of his life is really done through primary sources. We don't have the richness of sources that that journal is after that. So I would have loved to have been, to know what really happened there. But he became very politically active. He was a Jeffersonian, and then he became an advocate of Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson first learned the power of the newspaper press to impact public opinion. Andrew Jackson was outstanding at manipulating the press or using the press to help his political campaign. Did a great job with that. So as a result, Andrew Jackson rewarded 75 newspaper editors to come to Washington to get federal jobs. And William Hunter was one of those, came to Washington. And he ends up serving 8 presidents after Andrew Johnson. He worked in the Department of Treasury, right by the White House. The Treasury building there, right, still stands right by the White House. He lived at the southeast corner of New York Avenue at 12th Street. I had the unfortunate luck to tell the descendants that if they had kept on to that property, it's worth over $100 million today. So, they didn't like me telling them that, but they would have kept that. But instead, they invested some of that in this monument here. This monument is an 8-foot obelisk that is over William Hunter's grave. And this was, that William had a great relationship with his wife, Anne, because when Anne passed away, she says to her daughter, "You're only going to get any kind of legacy from me on my inheritance if you erect this obelisk over my husband's grave." So that was 10 years after her husband died. So that there was a great relationship there. And if you look down there, just real here, this little dark plain granite slab, that's Anne Hunter's grave. So she clearly valued that relationship. So I think it was very much a happy marriage. So, this is really a one-of-a-kind journal. And I hope you get a chance to spend a little time with Rita in the journal in the back there. I think it's just a wonderful piece of U.S. history. William's story it's a story of courage. It's a story of being intrepid, being gutsy, an immigrant story. He was an immigrant in this country. Many times he got into trouble because of being an immigrant, and people questioned his loyalty. They questioned why he didn't fight in the military. But it is one of a kind. It's an American story. So with that, I thank you very much, and we'll take some questions if there's some questions.
You mentioned that the diary covers 25 years, yes, earlier years of William's life. How old was he, or when he started the diary?
Well, that's a good question. So, I've used the term diary. It's probably more technically a memoir, but it's written like a diary. But it's a memoir. It had to be written after 1830, it's a because he mentions in the diary King Louis XVIII being in exile in the Holyrood Castle outside of Edinburgh, Scotland. So I know I can triangulate that facts of that. Actually, the memoir / diary it's amazingly accurate. For even those long years, you might say, geez, with all that time, he would be inaccurate. I'm able to corroborate through third-party primary sources almost all the information in the diary. I mean, there's a couple of embellishments. One of them is he said his father was in a grenadier company. I don't believe that that's the case. But what young boy wouldn't I mean, he was very proud of his father. That's kind of one you'd kind of expect. He also said his father was served under John Andre. John Andre served in the company next to his father. I mean, so you had things like that, but it's remarkable the dates and the battles and the stuff is amazingly accurate. Yes.
Just wondering how you came upon this and first got interested in it.
Okay, I could have mentioned that earlier. Let's see here. This woman right here, I was at her house, and she sat me next to Rita over here, and I didn't know Rita. And I said, she asked me, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm an aspiring historian." And she said, "We have a document. Would you like to look at it?" And I jumped at that chance. I didn't realize it was going to lead to 4.5-year exploration. So I thank you both very much for that. So that's how it came about the document.
You said that we should remember for a future that William had studied French while he was in Montreal, and I didn't see where that went.
Oh, I'm sorry. When he was a prisoner of war in France, he used that. When he came over, in 1778 and 1779, when his father was captured again on the way back to England from the United States, they spent a year in a French prisoner of war camp in Normandy. And so that's where he used his French. And in fact, in the journal, there's a little spot where he makes fun of the Shabbats. The Shabbats are the wooden shoes. The French peasants in that area wore, so it wasn't only just Dutch with wooden shoes, it was the French too. And he talked about hearing the clatter of their Shabbats throughout the streets there. So that's where he spent time with friends. Yes.
I was wondering if Rita could tell us how her family had been the steward of this valuable but delicate memoir.
That's great.
Well, it was in a box. It was in a box, and it was just handed down to me by one of my cousins, Louise, who was named after my grandmother, and I think my grandmother had it at one point. And my cousin said, "No, you should type this out and send it around to all the family," and which I did. I think I was maybe 16 years old. And since then, we just had it in a box, and we never really knew very much about it. So when I met Jean, it was a great opportunity to say, "Would you like to take a look at this?" So that was how it was. I just remember her sort of presenting it to me. I was a young journalist, and I wanted to be a journalist, and she thought, well, somebody should be doing something with this. So I just typed it up, and I'm sure I got some of the words wrong because they're hard to read when you see the writing. And we just sent it around to all the family, and we had a copy of it, and that was it. And I just kept it in a box. I moved many times, and I always had it in my things that I moved, and luckily it's still around. I'm very interested in what might have been cut out of it. It's over the years. So, or he actually cut things out of it after he thought about it. So.
Yeah, you have a question back there. Yeah, just while we're going to that question is, you don't know whether there was embarrassing things later on that were left out of it. You just don't know.
Could you tell us, please, after he had written the editorial, what became of the Alien and Sedition Acts?
Okay. There are actually 4 of those acts here. They did prosecute 26 people under the Sedition Act, and those people went to jail. When Jefferson came into power, anybody that was in jail got a pardon or commuted their sentence. Also, the day that Jefferson came into power, the Sedition Act expired. So it was not a long, it wasn't a permanent, it had a sunset period on it. The parts of the Alien Acts are actually in force today. So for example, one of the provisions of the Alien Enemies Act, it allows us to deport aliens that incite insurrection in our country.
Gene, why did Mr. Hunter go from Western Pennsylvania to Kentucky? I haven't caught the details in that part of the book yet.
Okay. Yes. Basically, when they were in Western Washington, Pennsylvania, which is basically it was on the road west, it was southwest of Pittsburgh. It was on the main national road going to the Ohio River, which would get you into the Northwest Territories. That newspaper he had done as a partner with John Coleridge. John Coleridge was a Federalist. And so in a small town, you got one newspaper. So you got you got a partnership running the paper. You get one week, you get Federalist editorials. Next week, you get Democratic Republican editorials. It kind of worked for a while. But what happened is that the vitriolic environment between the political parties increased so much that you had to pick a side. And so it just didn't work being together. And so he went west. Kentucky was growing like leaps and bounds. There was one, I guess there's another 1.5. And technically there were 2 newspapers in Kentucky, but he was one of the earliest ones that was there. He went to Washington, Kentucky. Washington is on the Ohio River. And the reason why he picked that, it was the post office for the Northwest Territories. So we don't think about that today. So all the mail going west went through Washington. You think, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, 2 big deals about that. One is you get the news before anybody else. So I get the scoop on everybody else. Second, back then, the governments subsidized newspapers by allowing editors to send their newspapers free through the mail. And so he could send his newspapers west and east. And so it was like being the center of the universe. So that worked out for a while. But then what happened was Kentucky decided to set its capital in Frankfort, which is about 90 miles away by river. And so he went there, and he saw that was going to be the reason there is that a state capital needed a newspaper. And he could be the person for that. So he started the first newspaper in Frankfurt. While there, he ended up being on the commission to build the state capitol. He started 2 schools, one for women, one for men. He was the town trustee there. He did, rivers, bridges, commissions. He did everything like a community organizer would do to help build that community. It was really a great place for him to be.
So he never sought elected office in Kentucky.
He was for 2 years. He was in the House of Representatives. Oh, I should say that differently. He was 2 years as in the House of Representatives, but he was elected state printer for 10 years. So that was an elected job. So he was and being the state printer was really the way to keep your newspaper going. The newspaper business back then, just as it is now, doesn't make much money. It never made any money. But he could make money being the state printer because he printed all the laws. He printed all the journals of the House and the Senate there, all the court decisions. And so that's that was a much more lucrative job. He also, and I believe his wife ran this. He had a bookstore that he ran. He would also print documents for people, bills of lading and receipts and that kind of thing. And he printed books. His books today, his law books he printed in Kentucky. You could buy those today if you'd like, but I'd suggest you have to bring your wallet, your credit card, and your whole bank account and savings to buy them. They're over $20,000. So it's pretty amazing. His first book he printed was a Spanish grammar book, and that's goes for about $600 or $800 today. So that's enduring. Stuff was enduring.
Well, everybody must be synced up with Zoom because they're all asking the same questions. It makes my life that much easier. But one question that wasn't asked is, how many children did William Hunter have, if he had any?
Well, no, I should have mentioned that. He did, I believe he had, well, we know for a fact only one daughter outlived him. And a second daughter predeceased him by about 20 some odd years. And a son predeceased him at least by 10 years. And then two infants, we have very sketchy information about that, other than they were inoculated for smallpox and then they disappear from the record. So I believe they died in infancy. So it was a tough life back then.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any other questions? All right. That's a terrible way to wrap things up with, but Gene, I want to thank you very much for coming out and speaking for us tonight. Thank you all for attending in person on Zoom, and all of you again for your support of our mission. So thank you all. Gene, thank you.
Yep.
And get home safe, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.